Hey, welcome to Fake ESPN, where the biomechanics is real, but the news is fake.
And now over to Dylan in the lab for the breakdown.
Thanks, Riley, and welcome to the breakdown. Today we will be analyzing the throwing mechanics of Derek Carr, one of the few great players on the Raiders that Gruden hasn't traded for a draft pick. To do this, we'll head to the field, but because of scheduling conflicts, we weren't able to get the real Derek Carr.
Our stand-in Derek Carr will be helping us out alongside the Raiders' 2017 leading receiver Jared Cook. The first phase of the throw is the wind-up, where Derek externally rotates his stance leg to get into a throwing position. He also externally rotates his throwing arm to bring the ball more laterally. After the wind-up, Derek enters the arm cocking phase, where his throwing arm continues to externally rotate, bringing the ball behind his head while keeping flexion in his arm. During this phase, Derek's weight is shifted toward his stance leg. Now in the stride phase, where Derek externally rotates his lead leg and then plants it onto the ground. As you can see, his lead leg lands directly in front of his stance leg. If he lands too far to the right of his stance leg, he will have to throw across his chest, preventing him from getting full rotation of his trunk, leading to a weaker throw. If Derek lands to the left of his stance leg, it will lead to him opening up his chest too early. Both of these situations will lead to inaccurate throws. After reaching maximal external rotation and planting the lead leg, the arm begins to accelerate. The acceleration phase involves synchronized movement of trunk rotation and internal rotation of the shoulder. During the loading phase, the obliques were stretched, increasing their potential energy, which is now being released as kinetic energy during this phase of acceleration. You can also see that the lead arm is being tucked. Much like how a figure skater tucks their arms, this allows Derek to rotate quicker. At the end of the acceleration phase, the ball is released. The angle that the ball is released determines what type of throw it is. A steeper angle of release will cause more hang time on the pass, allowing a receiver to run and get under the ball, where a lower angle of release will travel the same distance in less time to fit into a tight window of the defense. I'll discuss later in the segment some of the math behind this. Continuing with the throw is the deceleration phase, in which the arm continues to internally rotate and extend until there is little to no flexion. To aid in deceleration and avoid injury, the follow-through phase comes next. Because the momentum of the arm wants to continue forward, the use of the follow-through allows the body to continue moving forward and not injure itself. In the follow-through phase, the arm continues immediately across the chest, and the stance leg comes up off the ground and comes level with the lead leg. On harder throws where your momentum is higher, the stance leg will come in front of the lead leg to prevent the thrower from falling over. Once your momentum is stopped, the throw is complete. Now, let's head back to the lab and talk more about the release angle.
Welcome back to the lab. To help us break down the difference release angle makes, we will use a study done by Gregory Rash and Robert Shapiro, where the average release velocity of a ball was 18.2 meters per second in elite college quarterbacks. First, we will see how a 30-degree release angle affects the throw. The first thing we will find is the displacement of the peak height of the ball. To do this, we find the vertical initial velocity and find our other knowns to plug into this equation. This equation gives us 4.22 meters. Now, this is the peak height of the throw from the release point. We must add the 1.8 meters of the height of our quarterback to give us a total peak height of 6.02 meters. Now that we have found our peak height, we want to find the total distance that the ball traveled. To do this, we will plug in our knowns into this equation to find the total amount of time that the ball spent in the air. The first number we get, 0.93, is the amount of time that it takes for the ball to reach peak height. Now that our receiver is 1.8 meters and the throw was at 1.8 meters, we can just double this time to get the total amount of time the ball spent in the air. With this time, now we will find the horizontal velocity by using this equation, 18.2 cosine of 30, and multiplying that by our total time. This will give us the total distance in meters that the ball travels, which is 29.3 meters. To equate this to football terms, this is about 32 yards. Now we will analyze a throwing angle of 60 degrees. Much like our first problem, we have to find the vertical initial velocity of 15.76 meters per second. With the rest of our knowns, we will plug into this equation to find 12.66 meters. Again, like our first problem, we must add the 1.8 meters to account for the quarterback's height to get a total peak height of 14.46 meters. This is more than double the peak height of the 30-degree angle throw. With our peak height found, we now want to find the total distance that the ball traveled. To do this, we must first find the amount of time that the ball spent in the air. Like our first problem, we plug our knowns into this equation to get a time of 1.6 seconds. This is the time to reach the peak height of the ball's path. Because the ball is being catched at the same height that is being released, we can just double this time to get the total amount of time the ball spent in the air of 3.2 seconds. To find the distance that the ball traveled, we must now multiply that time by the horizontal velocity, which is found through this equation here. This gives us 29.1 meters, or again, relating it back to football terms, about 32 yards. To recap, while a 30-degree release angle and a 60-degree release angle both throw the ball 32 yards, there are distinct differences in the throws. A 60-degree release angle has a peak height almost double that of a 30-degree release angle, and also spends a lot more time in the air than a 30-degree release angle. On average, quarterbacks have about 3 seconds to receive the snap, pick a receiver, and then throw the ball. I don't know about you, but to do all this math in 3 seconds while avoiding pass rushers is a pretty big deal. That's what makes a quarterback so elite. But in reality, quarterbacks aren't as much elite throwers as they are elite biomechanists. This just in, Gruden has traded his dog Spike for a 5th-round draft pick to the Cowboys. Spike is said to replace head coach Jason Garrett starting next year.
Honestly, Spike might bring the Cowboys back from their rough patch.
Now to Riley with equipment.
Thanks, Dylan. Now let's talk about equipment. Sports concussions represent the majority of brain injuries occurring in the U.S., and they have been a major topic in the NFL. A concussion is an acceleration or deceleration injury resulting from biomechanical forces transmitted to the cerebral tissues from impacts to the head or torso. Rotational acceleration, linear acceleration, and impact location yield the highest predictive value of concussions. The most important piece of equipment to prevent concussions are obviously the players' helmets. Helmet designs are continuously being changed and altered in an attempt to find the most effective model to prevent concussions. Today's football helmets are designed to prevent skull fractures by reducing the peak force of an impact. Helmets have 3 layers. The first 2 outside layers are responsible for absorbing the most initial force from a collision. The outermost layer is made of polycarbonate and the middle layer is made of flexible plastic. The most important job that these 2 layers have is to convert the frequency of that incoming force to a frequency that the final cushion layer can then dissipate by vibrating. The other purpose for that inside layer is to reduce the amount of acceleration during an impact from another player. The most common type of acceleration associated with concussions is linear acceleration. Linear acceleration is the rate of change of velocity without a change in direction. What this means is that when a player is receiving force from another player, the inertia of the brain will continue in the direction of the player's velocity. But when that person is tackled, the body changes direction while the inertia of the brain continues in the direction of that initial velocity. When 2 players hit helmet to helmet, the helmet absorbs what is called an impulse, which is a secondary effect of an initial force, which in this case would be coming from the player. Impulse gives an object momentum and transmits kinetic energy through a system. It takes into account not just force, but also how long that force was applied. To calculate impulse, you multiply the average force by the length of time it was exerted on the subject. Let's put that into perspective. Let's say a linebacker weighs about 300 pounds and is running full speed at another player. That linebacker can produce up to 7,000 newtons of tackling force. Here's what some of these hits might look like. Now you would think that a tackle like one of these with this much force seems like a crippling blow, but according to John Melvin, an injury biomechanics researcher for General Motors and NASCAR, the body can handle twice that amount. The reason for this is all in the player's equipment. As long as the impact is well distributed, the equipment takes the energy from that incoming external force and spreads it throughout the equipment, essentially lessening the force. And now from helmets to fingers. Football is a tough game, and it is inevitable that your fingers are going to get bent in the wrong direction. By taping fingers at the spots where they bend, some players can prevent their fingers from hyperextending. One of the most common reasons players tape their fingers is to provide extra stability when catching a hard-thrown ball. They believe that it will absorb the force and prevent hyperextension. Players who need to throw the ball or catch the ball should not tape their fingers on the joints. Taping the joints inhibits the player from being able to completely flex their fingers. This becomes crucial when a player is catching a ball, but they can't apply an appropriate amount of force from their hands to catch it. But when it comes to offensive linemen and most defensive players, taping fingers on the joints can prevent dislocation and breaks. And after all of this, taping fingers might not even be effective when catching a ball. According to a study listed in the American Journal of Sports Medicine, it was determined that taping fingers does not improve grip strength. If a player decides to tape their fingers anyway, it is recommended that players use adhesive, non-stretch tape if they are trying to restrict an undesired motion. From heads to fingers to toes, let's talk about cleats. Athletes dreaded playing on artificial turf due to the serious turf burns from the friction between the surface of their skin and the plastic grass. Ankle injuries from inversion and eversion, and knee injuries from lateral and medial rotation were also a risk if players were wearing the wrong shoes. Biomechanical engineers Richard Kent and Jeff Crandall created a device to find a better understanding of the mechanics of shoe-turf interaction. The machine they created was nicknamed the Beast, which simulates the forces an NFL player inflicts upon his cleats. It was found that compared to rounded studs, bladed cleats were found to improve performance during changes in directions on both grass and turf. Turf tends to provide better traction than grass because turf increases the coefficient of friction between the ground and the cleats, enabling quick, sharp movements. Different styles of cleats can be more advantageous for different positions. For example, there are certain kinds of cleats that have better traction on the stance leg. This can specifically help a quarterback because the traction helps increase ball velocity when performing a throw. The other style of cleats presents a uniform pressure across the foot, which is most helpful for kickers because it promotes better kicking accuracy. That's all on equipment. Back to the studio.
Speaking of equipment, Riley, scientist James Conner has developed a new bionic arm capable of throwing up to 90 yards. Hopefully, the company can avoid termination of this product.
Thanks, Dylan. Now to Kayla on injuries, but we'll be back.
Thanks, Riley. Now moving on to injuries. For contact athletes, the shoulder is one of the most commonly injured joints due to its exposed location. Additionally, for overhead throwing athletes, the shoulder is prone to injuries due to the extreme force placed on it during the throwing mechanism. For these reasons, the professional football quarterbacks of the NFL are especially at risk for shoulder and elbow injuries. Appropriate management of these injuries requires a detailed understanding of the physical demands of the position, coupled with the knowledge of the injury and the profile of its unique position. For the anatomy of the shoulder is a ball and socket joint made up of 3 bones: your upper arm bone, your humerus, your shoulder blade, your scapula, and your collarbone, your clavicle. The head of the humerus fits into the rounded socket of your shoulder blade. This socket is called the glenoid. Surrounding the outside edge of the glenoid is a rim of strong fibrous tissue called the labrum. The labrum helps to deepen the socket and stabilize the shoulder joint. It also serves as an attachment point for many ligaments of the shoulder, as well as one of the tendons from the bicep muscle in the arm. Using what Dylan explained earlier, knowledge of the throwing mechanics involved in football passing is essential for understanding the impact of upper extremity injuries. Despite several similarities in the throwing motion between football and other overhead throwing sports, fundamental differences exist. Even when comparing the throwing motion of a baseball and a football, key mechanisms and kinematic differences result in unique injury profiles, which have important implications for management, such as a pro football is approximately 3 times as heavy as a baseball, and as a result, differences in arm velocities and the position of the arm and the trunk during the throwing motion exist. Shoulder injuries are the second most common injuries in the NFL, right after head injuries, like expressed by Riley. In fact, nearly 50% of all athletes in the NFL Combine have reported a history of shoulder girdle injuries, most of the athletes being quarterbacks, according to the article Common Football Injuries Among Quarterbacks. Injuries to the shoulder girdle can either occur from traumatic injury or result from just overuse of the throwing motion. Here are some of the common shoulder girdle injuries. On the traumatic side, we have AC injuries. AC injuries are consistently among the most commonly reported injuries in professional football. Injuries to the AC joint commonly occur following direct force to the superior or lateral aspect of the shoulder. Next, we have shoulder dislocation and instability. Shoulder dislocations and shoulder instability are relatively uncommon injuries among professional quarterbacks. Anterior instability is fairly common, particularly among linebackers and defensive backs, because when making a tackle, the majority of the force from the player comes from their leading shoulder. Next, we have SLAP or labrum tears. The term SLAP stands for superior labrum anterior and posterior. In a SLAP injury, the superior part of the labrum is injured. The top area also where the bicep tendon attaches to the labrum. A SLAP tendon occurs both in the anterior and the posterior of the attachment point. The bicep tendon can be involved in the injury as well. Here is Drew Brees' last snap as a Charger in which a SLAP injury occurred. Next, we have contusions. Muscle contusions and fractures are inherent to any collision sport and are associated with varying degrees of disability. Muscle contusions represent the second most common injury in the shoulder girdle in professional football. Next, we have fractures. Fractures stem from shear force. Shear force is when the force is directed across the bone. Next, we're moving on to throwing-related or overuse injuries, such as rotator cuff tendinitis. While injury to the rotator cuff is fairly common, actual rotator cuff tears are actually pretty infrequent, only representing about 1.8 of the total injuries in the NFL. NFL quarterbacks have slower arm speed, which decreases rotational and angular forces across the shoulder compared to baseball players. Additionally, the overall number of throws per game is significantly lower to football compared to baseball, so this is why the overuse injury is not as common. Secondly, we have bicep tendinitis. The long head of the bicep tendon is a common pain generator in overhead athletes. In professional football quarterbacks, bicep tendinitis represents the second most common shoulder injury related to throwing, following rotator cuff tendinitis, which we spoke of earlier. The bicep long head passes over the head of the humerus, aka the ball joint, and attaches to the top of the shoulder socket. The long head of the bicep acts as the shoulder joint stabilizer through depression of the humeral head. The bicep tendon travels through the bicipital groove on the front of the shoulder ball, which is where most inflammation occurs. Usually, this is friction related.
That's all for now. Let's head back to the studio for more.
Thanks, Kayla, for the great information.
You're welcome.
Thanks for tuning in to Fake ESPN, and as always, the biomechanics is real, but the news is fake. The biomechanics is real, but the news is fake.
Okay. Thanks for that great information, Kayla.
Okay, you're welcome. We're relating that back to the concussions talked about earlier.